Hidden on a quiet river terrace, just minutes from the runways of a major international airport, stands the oldest private residence in the state of Minnesota. Its limestone walls were raised in the 1830s, when this tiny village was the business capital of the entire region. The man who built it ran the regional fur trade from this riverbank, and later became the first governor of the state. And the ground it stands on was sacred to the Dakota people long before any stone was cut. This is the Sibley Historic Site at Mendota, and this is its story. We are in Mendota, Minnesota, one of the smallest cities in the state, tucked beneath the bluffs where the Minnesota River flows into the Mississippi. The name Mendota comes from the Dakota word Bdote, which means where two waters come together. Directly across the water rises Fort Snelling on its commanding point, and beyond it spread St. Paul and Minneapolis. Today we are walking the grounds of the Sibley Historic Site, a cluster of stone buildings from the 1830s and 40s. It is a compact walk, but it holds nearly 2 centuries of Minnesota history. The walk today is a gentle one, an easy loop around lawns, old walls, and buildings that predate the state itself. It is a September evening. The light is low and golden, and the grounds are nearly empty. This is a place that rewards slowness because almost nothing here announces its own importance. A quiet lawn turns out to be the yard of a fur trade empire. A plain stone wall turns out to be older than Minnesota. So walk slowly and let the layers come into focus one at a time. For the Dakota people, this confluence is not just geography. In Dakota oral tradition, Bdote is the place where the Creator made the first Dakota man and woman from the mud between the bluffs of the two rivers. That makes this meeting of waters the spiritual center of the world, a place of origin and of homecoming. For generations, Dakota communities lived, gathered, held ceremony, and buried their dead across this landscape. Everything you will see on this walk was built on Dakota Homeland, and that fact shapes every chapter of the story. From the grounds, you can feel why this exact spot mattered. The land sits on a low terrace above the Minnesota River, protected by the bluff behind and facing the water highway in front. Rivers were the roads of this country, and a house here stood at the busiest crossroads for hundreds of miles. Everyone traveling the Minnesota or the upper Mississippi passed this point. Whoever lived here lived at the center of things. Long before any trading post, Dakota bands made their homes along these rivers. Villages stood on the flats and terraces, and families moved with the seasons, hunting, fishing, gathering wild rice, and making maple sugar in their turn. The rivers carried canoes the way highways carry cars today, linking communities up and down the valleys. This was not empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a homeland ordered by seasons, kinship, and memory, and it had been for a very long time. In the early 1800s, two worlds began to meet at this confluence. French and British traders had already worked these rivers for decades, marrying into Dakota families and learning Dakota ways. Then the United States arrived, first with explorers, then with soldiers, then with companies and treaties. Mendota sat exactly where those currents collided. The buildings on this lawn are what that collision left behind. In 1819, the United States Army came to stay, and between 1820 and 1825, soldiers of the 5th Infantry raised a stone fortress on the bluff across the river. Colonel Josiah Snelling commanded the work and designed much of it, and the Army named the post in his honor when it was done. The fort was built above all to protect American interests in the fur trade. From the Sibley grounds, the fort and the village faced each other across the water like partners in a single enterprise. The Army held the guns, and Mendota held the goods. Stand on this lawn, and you are looking at one of the most consequential views in Minnesota. Soldiers, traders, missionaries, and Dakota leaders all crossed the water between the fort and this village. News from Washington arrived here first, and furs from the far prairies passed through here on their way east. For a few decades, this quiet spot was the hinge on which the whole region turned. It is hard to picture now, and that is exactly why the story is worth telling. From about 1825 to 1853, Mendota was a major center of the regional fur trade. The American Fur Company controlled the Dakota trade from this riverbank, gathering pelts from posts scattered across the country to the west. Dakota hunters brought in furs, and the company supplied goods, credit, and connections that reached all the way to New York and Europe. Warehouses, workshops, and homes crowded this little terrace in those years. The stone buildings that survive today mark the heart of that operation. Ahead now is the house at the center of it all, a solid 2-story block of gray limestone. It looks almost modest today, shaded by trees on a quiet lawn. But when it was new, there was nothing else like it for hundreds of miles. This was a headquarters, a home, and a statement of permanence on the edge of the American map. It belonged to a man named Henry Hastings Sibley. Henry Hastings Sibley was born in Detroit in 1811, the son of a prominent judge. At 18, he joined the American Fur Company, and he spent 5 years helping run its store on Mackinac Island. In 1834, at just 23 years old, he arrived at Mendota as regional manager of the company's Sioux outfit. He reorganized the department, traveled to the posts under his charge, and built both a stone warehouse and a stone residence here. He would spend the rest of his life at the center of Minnesota affairs. Up close, the walls tell their own story. These are rough-cut limestone blocks, thick and uneven, laid by hand nearly 2 centuries ago. The stone came out of a quarry close by, cut and hauled and stacked without machines. Look at the deep window openings and you can read the thickness of the walls. Buildings like this were meant to say one thing above all, that their owner was here to stay. The Sibley House went up between 1835 and 1836. A crew of more than 100 laborers, both white and Dakota, did the work under a builder named John Mueller. They cut limestone from a nearby quarry and raised the walls of what is considered the oldest private residence in Minnesota. Sibley lived here as a bachelor for 8 years, until his marriage to Sarah Jane Steele. Under this roof, he ran the fur trade, hosted travelers and officials, and built the connections that would carry him into politics. It helps to remember that this was never just a home. The fur trade ran on paper as much as on pelts, on ledgers, credit, and correspondence. Sibley's residence and his stone warehouse anchored the company's business across the whole region. Clerks worked here, guests stayed here, and deals that shaped the territory were made here. The quiet yard you see was once one of the busiest addresses in the country west of the Great Lakes. Sibley's early years here were lived between two worlds. He hunted with Dakota men, learned from them, and wrote about those hunts for a New York sporting magazine under the pen name Hal, a Dakota. In the winter of 1839 to 1840, he entered a kinship union with Red Blanket Woman, daughter of the Dakota leader Bad Hale. Their daughter Helen, also called Wakye, meaning bird, was raised by a missionary family and educated at a mission school. Ties like these were woven all through the fur trade world, where Dakota and European lives were bound closely together. Walking between the buildings, try to picture the village at its height. Mendota in the 1840s held traders, boatmen, laborers, and families from many nations, speaking Dakota, French, and English. Ox carts creaked in from the plains, and canoes and keelboats worked the shoreline below. It was noisy, muddy, and alive. The next house on this walk belonged to one of the oldest hands in that world. Jean-Baptiste Faribault was a French-Canadian trader, born in Quebec in 1775. He had worked the fur country since the 1790s, first with British interests and later with the American Fur Company. In 1805, he married Pelagie Aintz, whose father was French and whose mother was Wapikute Dakota. Pelagie held standing in her own right, for her Dakota relatives designated Pike Island, called Weetatonka, to her in a treaty signed in 1820. The Faribaults were exactly the kind of family that made Mendota work, French, Dakota, and American all at once. The Faribault House stands a short walk from Sibley's door, and it is the showpiece of the site. Its walls rise in warm yellow stone, with a dressed red stone face fronting the road. Even today it looks ambitious, and in 1840 it must have looked astonishing. This was a mansion raised in a village of log cabins and bark lodges. It says a great deal about how much money was moving through Mendota in those years. In June of 1839, Faribault signed a contract for a grand stone house, and by June of 1840 it was complete. It cost him $5,000, a fortune at the time, and it stood 3 stories tall. Inside were luxuries almost unheard of in the region: a bar, a ballroom, even a billiard room. After Pelagi died, Faribault eventually moved south with his son Alexander to the town that now carries the family name. Later owners tried to make the big house pay as a hotel, with only mixed success. By the 1850s, the world that built these houses was fading. The great fur harvests were declining, and Minnesota became a United States territory in 1849, with settlers arriving by the boatload. Mendota's traders became merchants, land dealers, and politicians. The last of the site's 3 houses belongs to that newer, changing world. It was built not of frontier limestone, but of city brick. The youngest of the 3 houses was built in 1854 for Hippolyte Dupuis, who worked as Sibley's clerk and secretary. Unlike its stone neighbors, it was built of brick brought in from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a sign of how quickly river commerce was changing what was possible here. Nearby stands a small stone cold store from 1843, where the fur company kept goods cool in the years of the trade. Today, the Dupuis house serves as the welcome center for the historic site. Together, the buildings span the whole arc, from fur post to territory to state. Take a moment here just to enjoy the grounds themselves. Old shade trees, mowed lawns, and low stone walls make this one of the most peaceful corners of the Twin Cities area. Freeways and flight paths pass within sight, yet the terrace keeps its own slower clock. Places like this survive because generations of people decided they mattered. And on the hill just above the site stands one more survivor from those early years. Just up the hill from the site stands the Church of St. Peter. Its parish community gathered in 1840, built a log church in 1842, and in 1853 raised the limestone church that still stands, at a cost of about $4,400. It is the oldest church of any denomination in continuous use in Minnesota. Faribault himself was among the early Catholic settlers who supported the parish. In a state where so much of the early built landscape is gone, Mendota keeps an astonishing share of what remains. Mendota today is one of the smallest cities in Minnesota, a few quiet streets between the bluff and the river. Yet it ranks among the oldest European-American settlements in the state. Walking here, you pass more surviving history in 10 minutes than most Minnesota towns can offer in a day. But the deepest history in view is not a building at all. It is the hill rising behind the village. Above Mendota rises a hill the Dakota call Oheyawahe, often translated as the hill much visited. It was a place of burial and sacred ceremony, and it stood as a landmark telling travelers on the rivers that they were nearly home. Later settlers called it Pilot Knob because river pilots steered by its profile. In August of 1851, this hill became the stage for one of the most consequential events in Minnesota history. On its slopes, a treaty was signed that changed everything. From the site, you can look toward that rising ground and imagine the summer of 1851. The United States wanted the rich lands of southern Minnesota open for settlement, and pressure on the Dakota to sell had been building for years. Dakota leaders faced an impossible choice, with the fur trade collapsing, game growing scarce, and debts mounting. Treaty commissioners, traders, and interpreters converged on this little village at the confluence. What happened next still shapes Minnesota today. On August 5, 1851, leaders of the Mdewa Canton and Wapikute bands of Dakota signed the Treaty of Mendota with the United States. Together with the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed by other Dakota bands that July, it transferred most of the Dakota homeland in southern Minnesota to the United States. In exchange, the Dakota were promised annual payments of money and goods for 50 years, along with schools, shops, and other services. They were left with a narrow reservation along the upper Minnesota River. In the years that followed, the government repeatedly failed to deliver what had been promised, and the consequences would be terrible. Sibley, meanwhile, was rising with the new territory he had helped create. He served as the territory's first delegate to Congress from 1849 to 1853. In 1857, he presided over the Democratic wing of the convention that wrote the state constitution. The next year, Minnesota entered the Union, and Henry Sibley was elected its first state governor, serving from 1858 to 1860. The fur trader from Mendota now led the state, but the hardest chapter of his story and of Minnesota's was still ahead. By 1862, the treaty system had failed the Dakota almost completely. Annuity payments were delayed, crops had failed, and traders refused further credit, leaving many Dakota families hungry and desperate. That August, war broke out along the Minnesota River between Dakota soldiers led by Tauye Judah, known as Little Crow, and the United States. In 6 weeks of fighting, hundreds of settlers, soldiers, and Dakota people were killed. Sibley, the former governor, was placed in command of the volunteer forces, and the fighting ended at the Battle of Wood Lake on September 23, 1862. What followed remains one of the darkest chapters in American history. Military trials condemned hundreds of Dakota men, some in hearings that lasted only minutes, with no lawyers to speak for them. President Lincoln reviewed the cases and spared most of the condemned, but on December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged at Mankato, the largest mass execution in United States history. That winter, about 1,600 Dakota people, mostly women, children, and elders, were held in an internment camp below Fort Snelling, within sight of Bdote, and as many as 300 of them died there. Most Dakota people were then forced from Minnesota entirely. Yet the Dakota endured, and the Mendota Mdewa Canton Dakota community maintains its presence beside these rivers to this day. Sibley left Mendota for St. Paul, where he remained a leading figure until his death in 1891, and his old house slowly fell quiet. In 1910, the Daughters of the American Revolution restored the Sibley House and opened it to the public, making it the state's first designated historic site. The site was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972, and today the Dakota County Historical Society helps keep its stories alive. Stand on this lawn at sunset and you can hold it all at once: Bdote and the fur trade, the treaties and the war, the loss and the endurance, all on one quiet terrace above the meeting of the waters. Thank you for watching. Follow for more of the trails of the world.